Let's talk about the parole of OJ Simpson. My name is Anthony Gangi. I'm the host of Tier Talk. Welcome to the show. It's the only show dedicated to corrections. Don't forget, guys, you can follow us on multiple venues: iHeartRadio, TuneIn, YouTube, Spreaker.com, Player FM, and the list is growing. Plus, like the page on Facebook, download the app. It's a free app. And we're going to start having our show on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network, which can be found on Vios in the 5 boroughs of New York. So I think it's a great little venue for us, if you will. Now, I want to talk about OJ Simpson, and he did get parole, and I want to kind of bring my expert here, John Paitakes, to kind of try to get a better understanding of how the parole system works. So, John, thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
All right, the reason why I have you on the show, John, is because you have over 50 years of experience in parole and probation, correct? Or in the criminal justice system altogether, correct?
Yes. Okay, I'm starting my 50th year. Yeah, it really went by fast. But as a criminal justice educator, also working in probation over 25 years. It's my second term on the parole board here in New Jersey. And so, yes, I have a combination of the 50 years in criminal justice.
Right, and actually, we're actually at Seton Hall, which is great. So the lights are on a timer. So if the lights go out, you may see me go like this. That's to get the lights to continue to remain on. But first off, if you can pass the word, right. I want to thank Seton Hall for allowing us to come in. But you also have a book coming out, hopefully in September.
Right. I'm hopefully it should come out in September. 50 years working in criminal justice, and part of it is biographical, talking about how I got into the system and what was helpful for me. And then the last 5 chapters are for students or people thinking of a career in criminal justice, some tips on how they can get into the field and be successful in it. So it's more of a practical type of text. Would be excellent for people thinking about getting a career in criminal justice.
All right, so let me ask you, okay, so how interested were you in watching the parole of OJ Simpson?
Well, I was very interested, and I watched the whole parole hearing because, again, we do those things in New Jersey or whatever, and I was just curious as to how it was being done in another state. So I watched the whole thing.
All right, so the outcome comes out, and he is granted parole.
Right.
All right, so how do you feel?
Well, I don't think it was any surprise based on the information that was presented. Okay. Now, again, remember, what we're watching is the information presented. We didn't have access to all the background information, social service reports, psychological reports, etc. But based on the information presented, there really was very little negative, Now, again, that hearing took an hour. There's no time limit on parole hearings. They can be 15, 20 minutes. They could be an hour. And on a serious murder case, it could be all day long, And I wanted to mention one other thing, Anthony, that I heard some of the TV programs saying this was the parole hearing of the century. And I'm not so sure of that, because years ago I sat on the Tom Trantino hearing, which was a murder case, cop killer from many years ago, I don't know if you remember. And he had gotten a life sentence and came up for parole a number of times. I was involved in that parole hearing, and that took 8 hours. Parole board, we spent all day long at Northern State Prison interviewing him for 8 hours. Okay, so in my mind that was kind of the parole hearing of the century. But anyway.
In order to, before you grant someone parole, right, you follow, I believe most states would have an objective risk assessment, right? And these are criteria that you want to make sure are followed before you kind of make that decision to let that person out. So, like, some objectives, criteria would be the programming. Did they take programming? What was their institutional adjustment like?
Right.
So, what are some of the things that you would look for when you were granting parole?
Well, okay, so you mentioned the risk assessment. There is a scoring mechanism and a range of scores that put people in a low, medium, or high thing. So again, if somebody comes out on a high score, now again, any type of instrument is never 100% accurate. I think they predict about 80% reliability, but that should put up a red flag that, oh, okay, let's look a little bit further or whatever. All right.
Now, what do you mean high? That they're gonna
that there'll be a reoffending.
Okay.
Okay. So again, it's something that should further investigation. In addition to that, we require a psychological be done on anybody coming up for parole. I'm not sure. I would assume that maybe Nevada does the same thing, but I'd like to see that report. And what did that say? Okay. If that also says that he's a high risk for further reoffending or whatever, then that's another red flag. The programming, there's a lot of programs available. You get a certificate if you attend, but it's not like a college course that you're getting a grade in or whatever. What did you really get out of it? So you can delve as much as you feel is necessary into, well, what are the things that will help you to control your temper? Tell us about what you got out of the course. Now, if somebody can't respond to that, then maybe they were just sitting in the classroom. So even though you got that certificate, is that really helpful? But if you can elaborate on that and say, well, look, I've really learned to control my temper in this way, et cetera, et cetera. So I would probe more further into that, and those type of things too.
Well, he mentioned that he took like an alternative to violence program,
Right.
and I believe that program was geared to address the concerns that brought him into the prison system to begin with, correct? So you want to, I know what we try to do is we try to get programs that are specific to the needs of the individual.
Right.
You know what I mean? So if someone has an addiction, you want to get them into programs that can help them battle or help her battle through
Right.
those addictions. But you also mentioned mental health reports. How important are those mental health reports? Like if you have a mental health report that says that this person is not ready, would you find parole ever going against those mental health reports?
It's possible. I don't want to say that one report will definitely cause the person not to be paroled, whatever. You really have to look at the totality. And so if everything else kind of negated that, then, again, even evaluations, depending on who did it, may not always be the most accurate projections, So, again, it would be good to have some additional information backing that up, But again, it'll be a red flag to further interrogate.
Right. Now, when you're going into a parole, you have to be unbiased. Now, a lot of people, when you look at the comments on social media, right? Okay, so now OJ Simpson was granted parole. Then you got a lot of people coming out saying, I can't believe he was granted parole, right? Then you got the father of Goldman coming out, wondering why we're putting him in protective custody, which we'll talk about in a bit. But in the meantime, what they don't realize is that you have to go in unbiased as a parole board, right? You have to be as objective as possible, which means that the crimes that he wasn't convicted of, whether he did it or not, are crimes that he wasn't convicted of. So therefore, you can't use that against him when making a decision. How hard is that?
Well, you got to be able to sort of block that out when you're making the decision. I mean, look, nobody on the board likes somebody who committed a heinous crime or whatever. But again, the court dealt with that. They gave him a sentence knowing that the person would come up for parole. The judge knew that, unless he says, life imprisonment with no parole. So your job is to be as objective based on the facts as possible, and if you're, accepting that position, then that's the oath you take, and you think about it, but it can't affect your decision.
Right. I know it's funny is a lot of people on social media also, again, you get the kind of sway of the public. There's really no consistency. But then there's some that thought that he was actually, this crime, he was sentenced as if it was the prior crime, like sentenced 9 years minimum on a 33-year stretch or whatever but again, on another, I want to mention about protective custody real quick. There was a concern from the public, again, just reading the comments, that they were shocked that the correctional system would put him in the protective custody area of the facility. And the reason why they do that, and again, this is just my opinion, maybe you could elaborate on it as well, is that he's high profile and you have to protect the inmate. A lot of people forget that we in corrections protect the inmate. So when he was granted parole, there could be a good chance that he could be a target. And because that's the case, we need to now protect him to make sure he gets out. Correct?
Right.
So what is it that you think the public misses with that? Like when you have Ron Goldman on air and he's complaining about the fact that we're putting this murderer into protective custody, that's someone that doesn't understand why that procedure is in place. So if you were to elaborate on it outside of what I just said, there is a need, right? Correct?
Yeah, again, anybody who understands the correctional system would understand what you just said. Okay, we have an obligation to keep them safe while they're in there or whatever, because what can happen sometimes is the guy who didn't get parole sees OJ Simpson getting parole and says, oh, geez, that guy got away with murder or did this and this and this. So he goads him into a fight. Well, now there's a fighting charge, and when there's a fight, and from corrections, they're both charged or whatever, so now he's got a charge. So that can happen, all right, and especially more so if you're a high-profile person. Now, you're also right that most people don't understand the system. Unless you worked in it or taken courses in it or whatever, it's hard to sometimes understand. And I find myself similar to you when I'm out in public and somebody says something about the correctional or criminal justice system and it's erroneous, I correct them on the spot, know. And one of the things I've told all my students over the years is when you leave this course, part of your charge is when you're out in the public and your friends or family mention something about criminal justice system and it's not completely right, then change them on the spot or challenge them and correct them. And surprisingly, Anthony, over the years, I've had a number of students email me back and say, hey, my cousin said this, my father said this, and I told them no. In class we learn, So again, it's about understanding the system. You don't have to agree with it, but that's the system we have, And when people say something like, there is no justice, yes, there is. There's a justice system. You and I may not always agree with everything a judge did or what happened someplace, but that's the system we have, and I tend to think it's one of the best in the world. So we've made a lot of changes over the years, and it's a lot better than it was 50 years ago. And I can say that by being around. When I started in the 60s or whatever, and now fast forward to 2017, there's been a lot of changes and a lot of positive changes.
Yes.
Is it a perfect system? No, but it's a lot better than it was, and I feel that we're improving it all the time.
Well, I always tell people it's the evolution of where we're at, and people right now, when they make judgment on a primitive notion of what they think we still are, and that's not the case, especially when you work in the system. And in my 15 years in the system, I've seen so much. And just going back to when we're talking about parole for OJ Simpson, just want to try to stay with this for a second. I'm trying to get I'm looking at social media, and I noticed that social media kind of goes back and forth with their responses. Okay, so you're going to have some that were all for him getting released, some that weren't for him, and then you have some that obviously are very aggressive with the fact that he shouldn't get released, and they start justifying that to the point where I thought if I was housing this inmate, the reason why I would want to put him in protective custody are for inmates that felt justified that they're doing the public a good. Because you have some people that have some weird minds that are locked up, and they may feel that, well, guess what? The public doesn't want him coming out. Obviously, you could see it, so I'm going to go ahead and save the public by taking him out inside the prison system. I know it's kind of unique, but it was some of the stuff that I was reading on the comments in regards to leave him in the population, let one of those inmates take him out. So it's crazy how the public can go back and forth, and the reason why they go back and forth is because they don't have an idea of what our job is or what our perspective is. Basically, our number one job literally is to protect the inmates in our care, and that somewhat seems to be forgotten. Also, I want to mention the parole panel itself. Now, the parole panel in this case was made up of 4 people, right? So how important is parole in regards to that you need more than one person on that board? You don't want one person making the decision, right? Because the decision would come off as being biased. So you have 4 people making a decision and 1 chairperson, correct? In this case, how I don't know where.
Yeah, it varies from state to state. In some states, in New Jersey, it's 2. In other states, it's 3. In some states, it's 4 or whatever. But the reason for having more than 1 is that, look, we all bring a certain amount of our own background to the table or whatever, okay? And so your job is, if you're coming off too strong, then I should be able to point out to you, Anthony, did you take this into consideration, et cetera, et cetera. If I'm coming off very lenient, then your job might be, as a second member, to kind of say, well, look, did you look at this and this and this? Now, we have to come to some consensus. If we don't, then they bring in a 3rd person, and it becomes 2 out of 3, and I think it was similar in Nevada, too, that, well, there it had to be unanimous, same thing there, and if not, then I believe they would have to bring in a 4th person to break the tie or whatever.
And if the person disagrees with the outcome, the inmate, they have another level up?
Yeah, they have a level to appeal, and I'm sure it's the same thing in Nevada. And actually, when we deny them parole in this state, we give them a copy of the form as to why they were denied. Then we also give them an appeal procedure form or whatever, and they hand carry that out of there. And they're not hesitant, if they think they've been treated unfairly, to write their response or whatever. They're entitled to. It's not a court hearing, but it's a hearing within the administrative section of parole, and they'll listen to the tapes and all the information, etc. And yeah, it doesn't happen that often, but sometimes there is, it can be overturned.
And that's kind of why you want to have your T's, as I mentioned before, your T's crossed and your I's dotted, because there's always going to be somebody looking at your work.
Right.
So if it's something surface that you missed, they're going to question your ability in that position, correct? Because you're in a trusted position.
Oh yeah, and I mean, it's your professional status. I mean, I have to say, the people I've worked with over the years, they all, it was more than just a job. You're out there setting the tone on the correction system. It's almost like a judge. I mean, the judge gives a sentence, but then the parole board decides who gets released and who doesn't. And so it's a really major responsibility, and everybody that I've ever worked with takes it very seriously. It's not like it may have been years ago ago, I don't like the crime you did or whatever, and I'm going to turn them down or whatever. But now there's documentation. You got to be able to back it up. Inmates will even get attorneys, if they don't understand, what happened, and they can appeal it.
Now there were some people that were shocked because there's the old rumor that you never get parole your first tryout. And it used to be that people would say that because it was kind of like the security blanket, if you will. You go up first, we deny you, and then if you make it the second time, we could say, well, we did deny you the first time, but at this point we had to kind of do something with you. So is that a rumor mill? Do you really deny the first chance the person's up?
No, it's interesting you said that, Anthony, because the first time I was on the board about 12 years ago or whatever, I had heard that same type of thing. Oh, people shouldn't be paroled the first time. So I went directly to the chairman at the time, and I asked him. He goes, no, he says, that's a rumor. He says, you just base it on the facts. And if the person qualifies and meets the criteria, first time or not, they should get paroled. So about half the cases that come up get paroled the first time, and about half of them don't. So it kind of just depends. On the information, So no, that shouldn't be any kind of precursor.
And, when you're talking about the information outside of the risk assessment, the score, the value of the score, do you also talk to the victims?
On the more serious cases, there's a victim input done. So in other words, members of the victim or the victim's family can come in and meet before the parole hearing with one of the board members. Okay, so they'll meet with one of the board members. It'll all be tape recorded. We pretty much let them say how the crime has affected them, etc. They'll give their recommendation. In most cases, they usually don't want the person paroled. We explain the system to them and say we understand your position. However, we have to look at all the facts that are concerned with considering them for parole. And so they do have that right. But again, it puts the parole board members sometimes in a difficult position. Take the case of a rape victim or whatever, and they raped somebody's daughter or whatever, and the father comes in and doesn't want the person ever coming out. But the person may have served 7, 8 years or whatever on the charge. So now you have to look at, well, what have they done while they're in prison? Does he meet the criteria? And if they did, then regardless, of the offense, your onus is to parole the person.
Well, I know that ultimately you're looking at institutional adjustment. Right, you're looking to see if the person did what they were supposed to do, why they were in the system, no charges, the programs that they took, and obviously, I believe, I'm trying to think of the OJ Simpson case, I believe you're also looking for someone to openly admit that what they did was wrong, and we had that discussion before, that you didn't feel he did that.
Well, take responsibility for what you did. Did you minimize your involvement? And it appeared to me that when I watched it, that he was minimizing his involvement in it. Oh, I didn't know they were going to do this. I didn't know that somebody had a gun or whatever. I think in previous reports it was indicated that he did know that. So it seemed a little bit that he minimized it. So we want him to take responsibility. We have the police reports. And again, if you pled guilty to it or were found guilty, we have to assume that you did it that way, right? Because if you didn't, then you should have pled not guilty or you were found not guilty. So, if you're now minimizing it after the fact, that takes away about your credibility.
And you take that seriously, correct? Like if you're interviewing somebody and they minimize what they've done?
We'll say, wait a minute, the police report indicates this. Well, I didn't really do it. Well, didn't you plead guilty to this? Well, yeah, but I did because of, well, look, we're not here to retry the case as a court proceeding. We have to go by the official versions, what you pled guilty to, Now, in addition to what you said, criteria, some other things are if you were on probation or parole in the past, and how did you adjust, okay? So that's a key thing. If you were on probation and parole and you didn't adjust in the past, well, now you got to convince us, well, what's different now that, if you're paroled, you're going to make a good adjustment, If you were incarcerated before, if you were in jail or prison before, and now you did another crime after that, well, you knew that this is where you may end up. So did that have any effect? So that's another, important factor. Are the crimes that you're doing now when you're coming up for parole, are they increasing in seriousness as compared to your first offenses? So if you went from shoplifting to burglary to aggravated assault, Jesus, looks like a trend, so that's a red, signal. Right. And so again, there's a list of, different things that would be checkoffs if it looks like the person, may not be paroled.
What about age? Is age a factor? And I'm not talking about like someone getting older and mature. I'm talking about someone that's 70 years old.
Well, there's research to show that people age out of crime. They're less apt to get into criminal activity, the older part. But again, I think, you still have to look at, is the person now a risk? Okay, so in other words, yeah, in many cases, they're not as big of a risk as they were at 25 or whatever. But if you look at somebody like, say Charlie Manson, okay, who's now 70 some years old, is he still a risk or whatever? Well, if you look at all, the reports on him or whatever, regardless of his age and his mental condition, he could still be a risk, So, it's something, you look at, but really the bottom line is, are they now a risk after all these years, or have they really convinced you that they've aged out of crime,
And now that he's being paroled over to Florida, if he violates parole in Florida, does he get shipped back to Nevada?
Right. So under the Interstate Compact, Nevada has the basic authority. So they compare, or they talk with Nevada, they tell them what the rules are, etc. Nevada Florida periodically should be sending progress reports back to Nevada. If he violates it somehow, then he can be brought back to Nevada and face the charges there as a violator.
Oh, so that's a good question. Okay, so when he gets paroled out to Florida, Florida has to keep information. Florida doesn't take full ownership of the individual coming, or do they actually? They have to continue giving information out to Nevada so Nevada can make the total.
Well, okay, they're transferring his supervision out to, not the whole case, his supervision. So it's a courtesy supervision. They have to agree to accept him or whatever. And if they do accept him, all right, these are the conditions also that he has to follow in Nevada, report regularly, etc. Right? If he's not following, yes, there are usually periodic reports that have to go back to Nevada. Okay, and if it's something flagrant or whatever that constitutes a violation, then he'd have to come back to Nevada.
That's good to know. I didn't know that, because I thought usually when someone picks up the contract, I was actually thinking that the person violates the parole, then he winds up staying in the Florida system. But you're saying that no, if he violates and it winds up violating parole, let's say he commits another crime.
Well, then that depends too. If it's a very serious crime that's committed in Florida or whatever, they may agree to have him face those charges right in
But
Florida.
he'll finish his time in Nevada.
Right.
And then have to be sent back over to Florida to start or finish.
Well, yeah, it could depend on negotiations between the two states too. On a very serious offense, yeah. There's always flexibility. There's rules and statutes, etc. But sometimes there's discretion in them. It's just like a judge. I can bring you in two judges that'll hear the same information, and one judge may find the person not guilty, and another may find them guilty. So sometimes it's their interpretation. And so sometimes the law is the law, but there's sometimes flexibility and discretion involved in it, and I'll just leave it at that. I'm not an attorney, so
no.
But just what I've seen over the years is what I'm relating to you.
Outside of OJ, you have a book coming out, 50 years. Right. So that's 50 years in the business of criminal justice, correct? Right. Everything from being in the field to education, correct?
Right.
Why would I want to buy this book?
Well, as I said, from just a human interest thing, if you're interested in criminal justice or whatever, because I also tracked in there some paragraphs and some written material on how I've seen it change in 50 years in law enforcement, courts, and corrections. So again, anybody working in the field might be interested in it. For a college student who's going to major in criminal justice, that certainly would, I would kind of feel it should be a required text. Somebody who's interested in, maybe I'm thinking about that as compared to, I don't know, sociology, business, or whatever, then read this first and see if that might influence your judgment. It's all based on my own personal factual experiences interacting with law enforcement people, prosecutors, public defenders, FBI agents, a variety of people in criminal justice. And it's all based on my own, knowledge of that and experience in it. So again, I think those are the people we appeal to.
I got to tell you something. 50 years is quite impressive.
Well, and I have to tell you, it seemed like it really went by. And people keep saying, "Well, when are you going to retire?" And I said, "Well, wait a minute. First of all, I enjoy what I'm doing. I don't have any plans of retiring. I'm doing some different things now, like interviews, guest speaking engagements, writing the book, I'm still teaching. So, you know.
Well, keep it going. Is there anything you'd like to say to my audience? Any advice you want to give after 50 years of the business?
Well, it's a great, it's a great career. If you like working with people, I mean, one of the basic things is you have to like working with people. So if you like working with people, then, this is one of the fields I think that you'll find very interesting. And if you want to make a difference, and you can make a difference in criminal justice, and I think that's one of the rewarding things,
Right. And me and John have a little history together because we're actually both members of the ACA, correct?
American Correctional Association.
American Correctional Association, New Jersey chapter, with a great group of individuals, Sherry Sandler, Bob Ricadella, and what we do is we try to promote training to frontline staff, especially in the state of New Jersey, and we just had a great event not too long ago, which you could find kind of like a little bit of a video montage on YouTube. I put it together. It was a great event. And we talked about pretty much the criminal justice system, and we talked about prosecuting hate crimes.
Right.
And it went very, very well. You were our keynote, if I remember.
Right. It was a good conference. Yeah, we had some really great guest speakers from prosecutorial to law enforcement people, and it was very well. And nobody left early, which was unusual, and I think that's a positive thing.
Well, that's the key. You don't want people. So again, guys, before I come to a close, just get my closing thoughts. The public is always going to be inconsistent in how they view corrections or anything related to corrections, including parole and probation, because they don't understand what it is that we do. And again, some were shocked why he got paroled. This was just an effort to kind of explain the procedure, how it works, but also some were shocked that he was put into protective custody, which we try to explain why that works. Our priority is to protect the inmate, especially a high-profile inmate like OJ Simpson, and him potentially having a target on his back for many reasons. One could be just that it's who he is, and I get my name connected to him if I keep him in, and some inmates may feel justified in that. But at the end of the day, it's an effort to educate us on the other perspective, the perspective that's kind of hidden and remains in the shadows of correction. So, again, we're going to touch on more as we progress. We're going to touch on more about probation, parole. We'll talk about solitary confinement because that's always an argument. I just did a show about that last week. We'll be doing it again. Eventually, I want to get perspectives of the inmates and try to build that middle road that literally is the road of compromise, the road of understanding, a road that kind of is not so on the extreme, because on the extremes we're never going to move forward. We really have to start moving towards the middle and help the system move progressively from both perspectives, the perspective of safety and security and the perspective of the rights of individuals who are in our keep. So again, the show is Tear Talk. Follow us on multiple venues: YouTube, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, Spreaker.com, Player FM. Follow us on Corrections One. Download the app; it's free. And like my page on Facebook, and also you'll be seeing us shortly on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. So follow us. It's on Vios. You can find it on the 5 boroughs of New York if you live in that area, or you can go to the website and it streams live from the website. As always, guys, the show is Tear Talk. Thank you, John, for coming on.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. And stay safe, guys.